Dear friends and colleagues, a very warm welcome to everyone who is present in this early morning hour, and both to our Latvian colleagues and those who have made this trip to Riga. I think we are ready to start our conference, and it is my pleasure to ask the director of Institute of Literature, Folklore and Art, and our good colleague daļa Bula to open the conference.
Good morning, dear guests, dear colleagues. Welcome to Riga and welcome to this conference, which is jointly organized by Latvian, Estonian and Lithuanian literary scholars. It's my pleasure to introduce this event, as I find the topic of this conference really challenging, as it invites to deal with complex issues of cultural diversity or even cultural multiplicity from the dynamic perspective of changing Baltics. I think contemporary Baltic states is a right place where to explore cultural change. And I really welcome the papers that promise to find out where are we right now, 20 years later, and what has happened to us in this passage from the intellectual and cultural center of the Soviet West to a less defined or even vulnerable place of the European East that has come along with our political gains. I read the abstracts of the paper proposals, and I found that there's a number of papers based on this processual perspective that seek to explore and to deal with the shifting geographies of culture, literature, and knowledge with dynamic relationships between centers and peripheries, between identities and differences, with processes of decolonization, of destruction of established identities and values. Comparative approach is another important characteristics of this conference. And I take pride in the fact that our institute has such a very strong group of scholars working in the field of comparative literature. This group is, the work of this group is to a great extent inspired and guided by Benedikts Kalnoč. He has managed to build up a very productive team of scholars. The main organizers of this conference, Eva Eglāja, Kristjona, and Pauls Daļa also belong to this group. Their work has resulted in several international meetings, joint research projects and publications, and this is also Benedikt's merit that our institute is publishing series comparative literature with already several published volumes. And to conclude, I wish you 2 days of intense intellectual work, productive coffee break communication, and lots of informal talk. And I also apologize for not being able to fully participate in the work of this very interesting and promising conference. Thank you.
Thank you, daļa, for this introduction, and just let me say some more words at the beginning. Books have their own histories, institutions, and also people and conferences do. And we gather at the 10th conference of Baltic literary scholars, a conference which is actually moving towards more interdisciplinarity in recent times. Our first meeting was in 1995 in Riga, and after that event, the 3 directors of the respective institutions, Institute of Literature, Folklore and Art, in Riga, Undra and Douglas, Literature Center in Tallinn and Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore, the three then directors, Viktors Hausmanis, Thomas Leave, and Vytautas Kubilius, they issued a joint manifesto saying that this is an important undertaking which has to be continued. Unfortunately, as the time, two of these people have passed away already, but the tradition continues. And I really hope that this event, these 2 days here, contribute to this tradition. I have found recent gatherings under the joint title of the Baltic Memory, which was initiated, this idea of the Baltic Memory, by a conference in Tallinn in 2005, and we continued in this mode for some other conferences. But now, perhaps it is time to redefine our focuses and to redefine maybe the subjects we discuss. And that's already mentioned, the title of this conference, the Changing Baltics. The Changing Baltics, and probably it's also, it also suits to the changing times, even maybe more than we expected when we announced this title of the conference last year. I'm very glad that during these years we had very good cooperation with the mentioned institutions, with leaders of these institutes, Jan Ondusk in Tallinn, Mindaugas Kvitkauskas in Vilnius, but many other colleagues have helped a lot along. And we are also glad that in this particular event, or in preparing this particular event, Anneli Michalev in Tallinn and Tartu and Aušra Jurgutiene in Vilnius have been really of great help for us. And the conference is also expanding in the sense that we have also more institutions represented here. We have more people participating from different institutions in Latvia, like University of Latvia, Latvian Academy of Culture, National Library of Latvia, and other institutions. And we also have more participants from more and different foreign countries, which with whom I hope we find a lot of shared experience during these days. So I welcome also people or colleagues from countries like Slovenia, Bulgaria, Germany, the USA, and all other participants. We are almost ready to start, so I would like to ask Professor Juri Talvet, Professor Aušra Jurgutiene, and Professor Vanessa Mataic to take their places as we move to the first session. And as the colleagues prepared, just a couple of technical things as we start. As we speak, we need to switch on one of these microphones, and the others must be off in order to talk. We agreed with the organizers, and I forgot a little bit, but I would like to join what Dace said. Really, many thanks to Pauls and Eva for helping to organize this event. We decided that we basically keep to this same pattern or try to keep to the same pattern in all sections. That we have papers first, and then there is allocated time for discussion. Let's hope it will work. Because we also have intersections, I think, as I read, for example, 3 abstracts in this particular session. And we also kindly ask the speakers to keep to the 20-minute limit. So I will also try to attract your attention after, let's say, 19 minutes. and so that we can finish your talks more or less in time. Somebody's laughing. I hope these are not who will be talking for half an hour or more. Okay, and if everything is more or less ready, then it is my pleasure to introduce briefly the first speaker, Professor Yuri Talvet. I really do not think a lot has to be said. Professor Talvet, as chair of Comparative Literature Association in Estonia, has been for years a lighthouse of comparative literature studies in the Baltic area, and has contributed really a lot to the studies both in Estonia and in the region and internationally. So it is really our very great pleasure to have Professor Talvet here at this conference, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Benedicts and dear organizers, for inviting me, and also for offering me the chance to be the inaugural speaker of this Baltic Conference. Well, the key words of my talk are fashion, officialism, and resistance. And now to apply these to more or less the language of our conference, I would say it means that the first fashion is in the sense of aesthetics above all, but also to some extent ideology, because aesthetics too is ideology. And so fashion, I would say, it is the culture of imitation or trend. Then secondly, officialism, I mean here the language of power, the political, economical power, officialism. And this is let's say, the language and culture of power. And naturally, it's ideology in the very direct sense. And then finally, it is a resistance. By resistance, I mean just the attempts to resist this fashion on the one hand, and on the other hand, officialism. So what is the purpose? The purpose is to create something that is deeply original and not depending on trends and the pressure on the part of official power language and power ideology. So this is these are the main ideas. I first intended or thought that I could give examples from the whole span of Estonian literature, starting from its beginnings at the start of the 19th century and coming to our 21st century. But then I understood that it was too long way, and practically I became fascinated by the work of Christian Jaak Peterson. That is the first important Estonian poet, and so practically I limit my talk to this, who was Peterson and his outstanding achievement. And I think still that the things that I speak here can be applied very well also to the beginning of the 21st century. So Christian Jaak Peterson, those colleagues who have been in Tartu have seen his statue. There is a statue near our 14th century cathedral, where we generally have the opening of our Tartu conferences. A tall young man who unfortunately died at the age of 21 years. So he was born in 1901 and he died in 1801, and he died in 1822, 21 years. But he had also a lot to do with Latvia, by the way, and with Riga. And so it is a very, very suitable topic for this conference. Now I see this. Yes. Okay. So, Kristjan Jaak Peterson, unanimously considered to be the first significant Estonian autochthonous poet, has remained somewhat alien to the posterior mainstream of Estonian poetry, taking shape above all since the time of the national awakening along the second half of the 19th century. Despite his unjustly short lifespan, Peterson not only excelled as a poet, but revealed his great talents and awakened spirit in its widest sense. After the abolishment of serfdom, our forefathers were serfs, he was one of the early autochthonous Estonians who matriculated at the University of Tartu. Peterson's father was a slave from the region of Viljandi, but thanks to lucky circumstances not known to us, he could move in the 1790s to Riga, this beautiful town, where he was a workman at the shop of a German and a church servant. Peterson's mother, to all probability, was of Russian origin. In the biggest city of the East Baltic region, Riga, where Johann Gottfried Herder, the great ideologist of the early European Romanticism, stayed in the 1860s and wrote his first influential essays, our Kristjan Jaak Peterson went to a district school and a high school where he learned Latin, Greek, Russian and French, besides knowing his father's language, Estonian, and naturally German. And besides, later he learned independently Swedish and translated from that language, Swedish, into German, Kristfrid Ganander's book Mythologia Fennica. It was published at the end of his life, of Peterson's life. Peterson's poems were fated to remain in a diary book manuscript, which, with other manuscripts, remained in the hands of Johann Heinrich Rosenplanter, a Baltic German educator and editor, born, by the way, in Valmiera, who since 1809 was active as a Lutheran pastor in Pärnu, my native town, and published a series of research papers, Beiträge zur genauer Kenntnis der estnischen Sprache, where our Peterson collaborated. Peterson's first poems ever published in print appeared exactly 100 years after his birth in 1901. In the following, the leading poet of our young Estonian movement, Gustav Suits, discovered Peterson, the poet for the wider Estonian audience, by publishing 13 poems in the Almanac of Young Estonia in 1910 and 1911. In its entirety, Peterson's Estonian diaries and poems appeared for the first time in 1922, that is exactly 100 years after his passing away. A new book of Peterson's complete work in Estonian was edited by Karl Taev, a former professor of Tartu University, long ago now dead, in 1976. And no more editions of Peterson's, so only 2 times Peterson's complete works have been printed in Estonia, and the research until recently has been shamefully scarce about Peterson's work. But it has to be admitted that it is not easy to treat his work, just because he is somewhat aside from the mainstream of Estonian poetry in the subsequent years. Well, it is but natural that any poet, at least in the initial stage of his or her work, relies consciously or unconsciously on a certain established manner, fashion, or style. Peterson could not escape it. By that time, some enlightened Baltic Germans had turned their attention to the Baltic rich treasury of oral folk songs and had collected these songs. Herder took a series of Estonian, Latvian and Lithuanian folk songs to his important book, Stimmen der Völker in Lieder. Quite a few of Pettersson's poems indeed follow the basically trochaic rhythm of Estonian and Finnish folk song. On the other hand, much stronger aesthetic support to his activity as a poet came from outside Estonia. These influences have been traced a long time ago, as Pettersson is especially famous for some of his odes. The most influential immediate forerunners in German literature were naturally Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock, whom Pettersson mentions in his diaries, but he must have known also the work of Goethe and Schiller, though he never mentions them in his writings. Besides, it is very important that in the diaries, Pettersson also mentions and writes about his contemporary Swedish poet of Karelian Finnish origin, Frans Mikael Franzén. Frans Mikael Franzén was Pettersson's contemporary. Franzén is generally considered to be the introducer of Swedish romantic poetry. He researched Finnish folklore and mythology, which also attracted our Pettersson. For that reason, the mythological background of the work of both Franzén and Pettersson radically differs from the sources of German, English, and other European poets of the centric Germanic Romanic area. I would call it one of the first symptoms of cultural resistance departing from the European periphery, a search for a Nordic identity, originality, and independence. Thus, Pettersson wrote in his diaries, and I quote, translation is mine. Oh, how good it would be if every country could be satisfied with what it has, because the same God that gave to Italy orange trees gave to the northern country proud oaks, and both of them are beautiful by their own origin. Therefore, it is very true what the Swedish man Franzén sings. And now he quotes fragments from a poem by Franzén, which have the initial line, Ingen erato pa tuules fjallar gratierna böd till dans. The main idea of Franzén in that poem is that classical Mediterranean poetics cannot produce great fruit in the north. In the second fragment, Franzén feels skeptical about Georg Stirnhjelm's introduction in the 17th century of hexameter, Alexandrine, classical Greek and Roman mythology, as well as Renaissance poetical forms in the Swedish language poetry. Franzén says, they were destined to lack in the north the fire splashed by the sun over the landscapes of Mantua and Lesbos. Although God appears in a number of Pettersson's odes, the poet never identifies him or her, I don't know, with the Christian God or the classical Greek and Roman deities. Instead, Karl Taev, the same Estonian researcher and former professor, is right in observing that despite the general similarities of his odes, of Pettersson's odes, with the imagery and tonality of Klopstock and other German poets in their odes, including, for instance, alternation of long and short phrase cycles, rhetorical questions, as well as enjambment, Pettersson did not fail to notice, in parallel with the cosmic infinity and life's totality, the very concrete and local Estonian phenomena. Taev refers above all to Pettersson's most famous ode, that is, as the title, Kuu, it is a moon, the moon in Estonian. Kuu is the moon. Now, let me quote here the poem in English translation of Harvey Hicks and myself, an American poet, Harvey Hicks and myself. It has been published once in a journal. The moon. Doesn't the wellspring of the song in the cold Nordic wind soak the senses of my people with its mist? If here in the snowy north the pleasant-smelling myrtle in a windy valley can beautifully bloom, Cannot then the native tongue of our country, that like a quiet creek without knowing its beauty is running peacefully across the meadow in the golden fire of the sky, or with a sounding voice without knowing its might with the heaven's thunder when the sea is loudly calling, cannot then the native tongue of this country rise in the wind of the song to the heavens and seek for it eternity? Then I will sing to you the stars of a clear blue sky, looking with joy from the earth to the high fatherland. Then I will sing to you, King of the night, the moon. You who in the lap of clouds, like a flower from its bud, with a merry white face, rise under the skies where hot stars are falling to the earth from before you into the black and gloomy mist. Thus you, human spirit, you are swimming in the mist as your thought is seeking God from below the stars. This is really a great, amazingly great poem, and also Pettersson has other odes and also pastoral songs that have a lot of interesting things, but I cannot just indulge here in a detailed analysis. Now I come to the what my colleague, Estonian good colleague Jan Undusk has had to say about Pettersson. Not long time ago, he published a very long article in our journal Keel ja kirjandus in 2012. Now, in very short lines, Jan Undusk's main purpose in his article is to demonstrate that Pettersson derived his odes directly from Pindar, and not so much from the later German and other European poets. Undusk claims that Pettersson, with all his talents, could not invent by himself the type of ode. And Undusk defines this as a slender ode, in the sense that Pettersson applied in his ode very short lines. Thus in the poem The Moon, the length of the verse varies from 5 to 7 syllables. Abundant enjambment and phrase cycle extending through a great number of lines. However, in the conclusion, Undusk has to admit that he could not discover any direct sources for Pettersson's slender odes, though he admits that Goethe, above all among German poets of the era, in fact relied on a slender rhythm in a number of poems. And Undusk, I quote Undusk now is puzzled how Pettersson could invent something that was not before. And he is skeptical that Pettersson could invent something. I quote, of one's own wisdom, such verses could not be born. Such a form has to be learned. Now, this is Undusk's conviction, but now my conviction is different. I think that I rely on Juri Lotman's ideas on syntagmatic and paradigmatic patterns, that poets more or less, more than on syntagmatic patterns, they rely just on paradigmatic patterns. And indeed, there are, so to say, explosions or leaps when sudden new originality is created. And on that ground, I compare, I don't have time, but I compare Pettersson with Dante Alighieri, who is practically the founder of the European poetry of the new era, or the budding new era on the transition period from the Middle Ages to the early Renaissance. And I quote here, quite on the contrary, the achievement of Christian Jaak Pettersson at the earliest stage of conscious Estonian autochthonous poetics could be compared to the explosion that took place in European poetry in the work of the great Italian Dante Alighieri. Naturally, there is no denying that our peripheral Pettersson could not rival the influence that Dante has had for all the posterity in the Western poetic tradition. But they coincide in the nature of their poetic deed. Both were philosophically minded poets with a strong and original ethicality forming the nucleus of their universe of the mind. just like Dante, who wrote the first fully serious philosophical treatise Convivio in the vernacular Italian or Tuscan language, defying the supremacy of Latin. Half a millennium later, Pettersson did the same as regards the Estonian language. He not only pronounced in the above-quoted poem Kuu his famous existential question, cannot then the native tongue of this country rise in the wind of the song to the heavens and seek for eternity, but he demonstrated in the same poem and several other poems that indeed that language, the Estonian language, could rise in his creation to the heavens, just like Dante had before him sought eternity in this Divina Commedia. And I will not go here further, but I will conclude thus I would qualify Pettersson, our first great Estonian poet, under the sign of resistance. He sought original Estonian expression in poetry in harmony with the nature of the Estonian language. He rejected fashion, hitherto dominating Western mainstream formal poetic patterns, as well as the ideological officialism, which in those times crudely neglected and suppressed cultural needs of minority ethical communities. Pettersson can be seen as a great forerunner of freer poetic forms, as well as of a new ethical philosophy in world poetry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have been very exact with your presentation, which will allow us hopefully some space for discussion at the end of the session. But now we move to our next speaker, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Vanessa Mataic. Vanessa has been in Estonia several times at the conferences in Tartu, where we also met. And she is a professor at the Department of Comparative Literature and Literary Theory at the Faculty of Arts, University of Ljubljana. And as, in fact, all speakers in this first panel, Vanessa Mataic has been very active as a scholar of contemporary literature. She has been also the president of Slovenian Comparative Literature Association and has inspired many colleagues with her work. And Vanessa also continues, I think, very good and very also theoretical tradition of Slovenian scholarship. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In my paper, I will try to argue my opinion written in the title of my paper, that is Cultural Diversity and National Literature, the Seeming Conflict. I'd like to propose the way of how I try to explain some of the meaningful contemporary changes in field of relations between national literatures and their cultural spaces. I will focus on Slovene literature, but some radical changes that have appeared in some Slovene literary works will be also observed from the comparative transnational aspect that has characterized comparative European literary studies. Why I must follow the practice of this transnational comparative orientation? Because similar changes have appeared in a wider literary context of the Northwest and Central Balkan too. This can't be an accidental phenomenon. And moreover, it can probably serve us for comparing it with relations between national literatures, such as Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian, for example, national literatures and cultural spaces of the changing Baltic. Because the transnationally oriented European comparative literary and cultural historical studies have discovered an impressive set of similarities, differences, but also similarities perceived in literary histories, and cultural memories of especially those European nations that in course of the 19th and 20th century were engaged in the political process of a national state formation. That is probably the reason why these similarities are so meaningful and powerful. I think so. In Blerson's denotation, these similarities can be described as the so-called separatist nationalism. And according to the tradition which was motivated by Johann Gottfried Herder, as Juri Talvet already mentioned, in many cases of the South Central, East and Northeast European cultural political histories, national languages and literatures were considered as the most integrative means for a community that recognized itself as a nation, and therefore it was the national literature and culture that had to act a political, state-like role of integration. In this so-called cultural syndrome, the common transnational model was at work, and this model, theoretically developed by German Romanticism, was probably the model of the so-called Kulturnation. The question is whether this transnational model of Kulturnation can explain the changes that have appeared in the contemporary national literatures of Balkan and maybe in Baltic cultural spaces. In order to explain the contemporary changes in relations between national literatures and their cultural spaces, I will use two concepts borrowed from Homi Bhabha's post-colonial theory, namely the concept of cultural diversity, which was rejected by Homi Bhabha as a sign of an inconvenient colonial mentality. The other concept is the concept of cultural difference, which, associated with the so-called third space, can explain cultural and, in our case, also literary changes in a more tolerant way. To conclude with this introduction to our question, let me say that although one can agree with Anderson that the nations shall be considered as imagined communities, and although one can agree with Homi Bhabha that nations were formed as narrations, the fact is that the idea of nation and national right for political emancipation has caused a very, very real historical reality of the 19th and 20th century Europe. From the aspect of European historical conditions, it is not hard to understand that the prevalent identity of one cultural space reveals itself as a unified and firm and stable national identity. On the other hand, the postmodern history of Europe tends to recognize the cultural diversity or even the cultural difference as the only possible kind of a firm identity of one cultural space. What does it mean for our question? Let me start with the first case, the first Slovene literary text, which I have chosen for explaining the contemporary changes in relation between national literature and culture. This is the novel of Andrzej Skubic, written in 2009. It is not easy to translate the title of this novel. In Slovene, it is Lahko, and this is very ambiguous title. It includes the meanings such as, for example, it can be, or so easy, or simply easy, and so on. The protagonist of the story is a woman. Her name is Agata. Skubic's Agata belongs to the Romani community. The story of Skubic's novel refers to the real historical event that happened in Slovenia in November 2006. In the southeast area, a violent conflict broke out in one Romani settlement, and this event proceeded to a more extensive and very serious conflict between Romani and Slovene inhabitants of this area. Skubic's story represents the protagonist, Romani Agata, in her sometimes unwillingly attempts to escape by the help of the State Secretary of Slovene Ministry of the Interior. namely the State Secretary of the Romani Affairs. Although the story can be interpreted as fiction, the emotions of anger, despair, and fear are very true for the protagonist, for the State Secretary, and for both of the communities, among which those one that represents Slovene cultural community articulates itself, its reflections and feelings on the public chats on the web. The novel quotes the discourses that circulate in the contemporary Slovene cultural space. These discourses are represented as dialogues between the central literary figures, interior monologues of the State Secretary, and as direct quotations borrowed from the public chat. In this representation, the ambiguous mentality of the State Secretary and of the two-faced state of mind of the contemporary Slovene society are revealed. The mental scale expands from the explicitly hostile speech to, on the other hand, the tolerant acceptations of the cultural other. In this respect, the novel represents the inner cultural diversity of the contemporary Slovene society. This inner cultural diversity is explicitly recognized and ambiguously received by the contemporary Slovene society as it is represented in Skubic's novel. Let me repeat, the represented society is aware of its inner cultural diversity, but the society still cannot accept this fact in a tolerant way of accepting the cultural difference in Baba's sense of the word. As we know, Baba rejected the concept of cultural diversity as the one which confirms firm and stable identities and therefore also firm and stable divisions of cultures in which, according to the Western metaphysical tradition or mentality, the majority of them are necessarily subordinated to the dominant culture. The dominant culture is, in Baba's cases, the culture of the colonizer. And therefore, the concept of cultural diversity necessarily ignored the fact that interactions between individuals or cultures necessarily result in hybridizations that necessarily change both of the individuals or cultures involved in this interactive process. In Skubic's novel, as I already said, the represented contemporary Slovene society can recognize its inner cultural diversity, and its dominant Slovene cultural community feels as to be endangered by this fact. And on the contrary, the same is true for the Slovene Romani community. This feeling of being endangered by the cultural other simply obstructs the awareness that interactions between two cultures actually produce changes in both of the cultures, hybridizing them with the cultural other. Skubic's novel actually represents this mental state by the means of confronting the discourses that circulate in a society. The same literary strategy was used by some other contemporary authors from Balkan territory. One of them is Andrei Nikolaidis, the writer from Montenegro. The meaningful title of his novel is Mimesis, written in 2003. The novel refers to the Yugoslav wars between 1991 and 2001. And as a literary, mimetic discourse, it quotes the discourses that in the 90s in Yugoslav cultural spaces have intensively renewed the national historical myth. A similar way of deconstructing the myths that characterize one national cultural space was used by the writer who was considered as Croatian writer until he had resigned from the Croatian Writers Association and returned to Bosnian capital Sarajevo. This writer is Miljenko Jerković with his novel Ruta Tannenbaum, written in 2006. This novel refers to the cultural diversity recognized by Croatian society in Croatian capital Zagreb during the World War II. Both of these writers provoked a very unpleasant feeling in their national cultural spaces and their cultural political authorities. Jergović, with his deconstruction of the mythicized national history, and Nikolaidis, with extending the effects of the national historical myths up to the present. It can't be an accident that both of the authors decided to move. They moved to Bosnian capital Sarajevo. In my opinion, these novels, the novels of Skubic, Nikolaidis, and Jergović, deconstruct the very idea of cultural diversity by representing a number of various discursive hybridizations that are at work in society in which the dominant culture appears as national culture and considers the territory in which it takes place as a natural national cultural space. Thus, these novels cross the borders of the concept of cultural diversity and actually perform Baba's concept of cultural difference. And thus, these novels, written by Skubic, Nikolaidis, and Jergović, can be interpreted in the aspect of another Baba's concept, namely the concept of the third space. I'm afraid I don't have enough time to develop the other opinions that I want to argue in my paper, but I'd like to conclude with this. In my opinion, I think that this deconstructive kind of national literature perfectly reflects the tradition of a natural national cultural space, because it refers to the very image of a national cultural space that is represented through revealing its contemporary changes. Although this specially oriented and culturally deconstructive kind of literature deconstructs the linguistic standard of national literature, this is national written language, in these deviations, it still explicitly refers to the national language and, of course, to national literature. In addition, it represents the contemporary idea of cultural diversity and confronts it with, as a matter of fact, the stream of hybridizations that perform cultural difference in Baba's post-colonial sense of the word. Literary representations of the contemporary cultural changes in form of these hybridizations can, in my opinion, only enrich and therefore develop one national literature and its artistic ability. This kind of literature is produced by the authors who dare to cross the traditional borders of national cultural memory. And I hope that I won't be wrong if I would like to designate these authors with the term that I learned from Juri Talvet, from Juri Talvet's essay on the author. I'd like to designate the authors whom I mentioned in my paper as the semiotic symbiotic authors, who, representing cultural difference, enrich and develop their national literatures. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for what was, I think, a very intense and very interesting paper. And we now have the last speaker in this section. It is, again, my great pleasure to introduce Professor Aušra Jurgutiene, who works both for the University of Vilnius and for the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore, which has been our long-standing partner in cooperation. And Aušra Jurgutiene has personally contributed quite a lot to this productive cooperation. Aušra has also worked on different projects linked to studies of literary theory. In Lithuanian, several volumes of discussions of contemporary literary theory have been published, and also these books have been promoted on an educational level, I would say. So it is always very interesting to follow what Aušra Jurgotiene says, and hope it will be the case today as well.
Sorry, thank you. Perhaps I will prolong this topic about something about national identity and its deconstruction forms. So my paper, The Deconstruction of National Identity in Lithuanian Literature and Ivaškevičius Theatre. In the age of globalization, national identity is becoming more problematic than ever before. We have observed an increased interest in problems of intercultural dialogue and clash between heating and cooling national identities in Lithuanian literature. The heating national identity is created by mythologizing and romanticizing the origins of history of a nation. Although Lithuania never had a national epic, we can distinguish three major myths or stereotypes concerning the national identity, Lithuanian national identity. The first national myth is the legend about the Lithuanians, most of all, of course, Lithuanian nobility, origin from the Romans. The legend is found in the chronics of Lithuanian of 15th, 16th centuries. The stereotype of Northern Athens as a poetic and strongly emotional vision is still alive in the consciousness or unconsciousness of a Lithuanian culture. Following the restoration of independence in 1919, the cultural weekly was named the Athens of North. Another national myth of Lithuanian cultural identity was created and spread in the works of Romantic writers, such as Adam Mickevičius or Simonas Daukantas, and was especially influential until Second World War. It proposed the idea that identity of Lithuanians is a synthesis of Western and Eastern cultures. Stasys Šalkauskas, a philosopher, interwar philosopher, wrote the quotation, "Merging the two, that is Eastern and Western worlds, is a high calling of a nation, worth the greatest efforts and substantial sacrifices," the end of quotation. He stated that Lithuanian has absorbed the surrounding influences of the rational West, German, and the mysterious East, Slavs. It is able to maintain the balance of two major cultural influences. We can see the manifestation of this idea of many literary work of very different Lithuanian writers, and even in paintings of Mikalojus Čiurlionis. Lithuanian artists realized that they live on the edge of two worlds and are continuously affected by the winds from the east and the west. And the third myth of Lithuanian national identity was based on the ideas of rural culture and the visions of a golden age of the ancient Balts. And there are a lot of writers, Vidūnas, Maironis, Vaižgantas, Aistis, Bradūnas, Marcinkevičius, Martinaitis, who wrote about it. A romanticized national identity was particularly appreciated during the period of Soviet occupation. And the literary works therefore remained sentimental and melancholic and invoked feelings of longing. We have acknowledged that hitting national identity with myths of a golden age makes the necessary emotional glue, bringing harmony to society. A coherent narrative and national history and collective memory are inseparable from the ideology of nationalism, as Benedict Anderson explained in his books. But the national identity can be also cooling. The alternative way of viewing the national identity was presented by Vytautas Kavolis at first, a migrant anthropologist. He relates a cooling identity to critical and objective self-interpretation and putting the creative powers of a nation to work. Critical and creative interpretation of national identity is developed in the Leonidas Donskis articles, for example, Globalization and Identity, or in Nerija Putinaitės book, Exiles of Athens of the North. Thomas Venclova in his books emphasizes it is important for a modern person to feel he or she belongs not only to the nation, but also to the whole world. The modern identity promotes thinking out of a box and encourages national self-criticism. We also have to emphasize that the national ideology, when it used too trustingly, can foster chauvinism, intolerance, and ethnic conflicts. Of course, we know that, for example, 25% of Russians supported the occupation of Crimea. The impact of patriotism on society can be compared to the deconstruction ambivalent term pharmacon, which means that medicine used in too great dose may become poison. Therefore, deconstruction suspicion of a national myths does not weaken national health, for my mind, as may appear at the first glance, but may actually strengthen it. Cooling identity manifests itself as deconstruction of eating national identity. It uses parody to neutralize its toxicity. We can find such cooling identity in the works of Škėma, Venclova, Gavelis, Beresnevičius, Erlickas, Parulskis, and Marius Ivaškevičius. The two plays of the later author, Madagascar and Expulsion, still find a great resonance with readers and theater audience and will be the subject of my paper. In the play Madagascar, the main character is a parody of a national intellectual and idealist. He is named after the historical prototype Kazimieras Pakštas by changing his name one letter, and from the name Pakštas, creating the new name Pokštas, which is in Lithuanian means joke. So joke makes his appearance on stage with a grand geopolitical idea. Since Lithuania is so small country and it has no place in between the large countries such as Russia, Poland, and Germany, it needs to seek a safe refuge to an uninhabited Africa or the Isle of Madagascar. Lithuanians must turn west to achieve this goal, reject all negative traces of Eastern passivity. Joke even comes to Paris to meet the ambassador, Lithuanian ambassador Oskar Milaš, prototype of Oskar Milaš, symbolist, poet, symbolist, and ambassador to France, to convince him to move from France to Angola and to prepare himself to accept Lithuanians, which he is going to send him from Lithuania. Excited by Joke's idea of a reserve Lithuanian, Oskar reveals a vision of his own, which is even more bizarre. He discloses that the moon sends him visions of a future. They tell him, among the other things, that the half of moon shall fall on Russia and thus free a vast space to restore Lithuanian former grandeur. Moreover, Oscar tells the myth of Palamon, which suggests that Lithuanian origins from the ancient Romans. He even argued with patient reading of the hook that it is not Lithuanian who originate from the Romans. In fact, it is the Romans themselves and even the Greeks, such as Sophocles and Socrates, who descends from Lithuanians. According to him, Lithuanians lived in Atlantis, and after it sank, this isle sank, they sailed to Greece. It was only later when they descendants moved to Rome, and from this they sailed to the shores of the Baltic Sea. National ideologists who promote the visions of a people can be not only funny, but at times dangerous. Therefore, it is not accidental that Stefano Moretti, the Italian director who staged Madagascar in Turin and who focused on the conflict between utopia and dystopia, was shocked to notice the resemblance of jokes in size regarding the nation's living space to the speeches of fascist leader Benedetto Mussolini. We encounter the bookish person. His ideas are attractive on the outside, but they fail against reality and are therefore tragic. Is it Joe calls to the people of his village 2 times, alas, misunderstood and rejected, having given the spectators a good laugh, he burns into tears. The playwright means to tell us that the village, idealized by many preceding authors as a pristine environment to national south, is too inert, too conservative, and cannot respond to the historical challenges and to new ideas it is confronted with. It is obvious that the rural identity cannot keep the modern nation together longer. But it is still unclear what it could be replaced with. Joe, who orients the nation to the West, has a chance to meet a charming lady from the opposition political left named Saleh, prototype famous poet Salome Nėris. These 2 characters who cannot understand each other and got the act together mock the romantic abstract idea which was popular during the interwar period of Lithuanian as a synthesis between West and East. And at the end of the play, Joe burns into tears for the third and final time, because his enthusiastic idea about the relocation of the nation to the better geographic place was unexpectedly fulfilled in a paradox manner. The hasty exodus of Lithuanians to the west, fleeing from the communist terror. Joke is found in their group too. Such deconstructive turnover of the idea of national relocation to the better place also reveals to us how unclear the horizon of national future and national identity really is. Ulfo Ivaškevičius' Madagascar is a text and depicts the interwar period of the 20th century. He in fact addresses contemporary spectators who are at times still naive enough to believe in the romantic myths and who believe that with the re-establishment of independence and Lithuanian membership of the European Union and NATO, the nonsenses of the world are things of the past, far as they are concerned. The paradox of the pre-war idealist in the play is intended to sober up the naivety of such people today. By looking at the joke, the main character of a play, we are meant to see ourselves with all our World War distortions and utopias. The topic is so relevant today that soon after Madagascar, playwright received a request from the Lithuanian National Theatre to write a play about present-day emigration. In the next play, Expulsion or Banishment, it is difficult to translate too, he keeps investigating the same problem of national identity as he did in Madagascar. The play depicts a dramatic interpretation of Lithuanian immigration into the island culture. Benas, protagonist of the play, takes a van together with some other young Lithuanian and leaves for the West in search of a better life. However, they are all minced by the golden grindstones of the free market. They were brought to England as a cheap illegal labor, and in order to survive, they must adapt in the alien culture. But are there actually limits to how much they are able to adapt? For example, one guy in this play is very proud that he got a good job in a rich English family. The master used to take him to the hunt, where he had to collect his shorted ducks. We, of course, understand that it is job of a dog. Writer said, Ivaškevičius said, a problem, social problem, and even moral problem about adaptation of poor immigrants into the rich societies. And the protagonist, Benas, has to grow from various stages of integration into the new society too. He becomes married, the security worker of nightclub, and even the robber, the policeman, to raise himself from the place of a loser to the loser, and seeks to revenge of English cool face who had previously beaten him up. He is lost among changing masks and between two forces tearing him apart: Western culture, symbol Christ, and Eastern Mongol Thai barbarism, symbol Genghis Khan. This is evident from the conversation with his friend in Emigration Vandalas. And I would like to quote this conversation. I think it is important. Benas, Vandalas, I am telling you the essential thing. Vandalas, what the fuck do you mean? Benas, the very essential one. If you have a Mongol in you, Christ does not love you. They were able to come to terms before, not any longer. Now it looks as if they are at odds with each other. Vandalas, Genghis Khan, Benas, yes, with Christ. Christ wants us for himself. Genghis Khan does not let him have us. Vandalas, you mean Lithuanians? Benas, Mongols, his offsprings. Vandalas, fuck you. Where did you get it from? From books? Benas, it's in the ear, you drumhead. Don't you feel how they are fighting against each other? Vandalas, fighting? With what? With words? For fuck's sake. Benas, with us, in place of thoughts. The end of quotation. In this context, Ivaškevičius debates by using artistic means against popular nation myths and especially against the perception that Lithuanian identity is unique synthesis of Eastern and Western cultures. On the contrary, the conciliation of these two forces in the global world, where the Eastern Genghis Khan and the Western Christ rattle their swords against each other, is all too distant. What is the real identity of Lithuanian today? The constant changing of social roles and masks. We couldn't see what the outcome of that permanent struggle between the contradicting parts of their identity is going to be. The constructive identity problems raised by Benas and by Joke too are becoming part of a social agenda today. Critics refer to Ivaškevičius as anthropologist investigating the problems of national identity and as creator of relevant political drama. Christian Lupe, a Polish critic, called Expulsion a Lithuanian saga or a new national epic. Ivaškevičius' plays received controversial reviews from critics. The main point, however, is that both opponents and sympathizers of Ivaškevičius' works draw the same conclusion, that his plays are about the deconstruction of national myths. But the deconstruction itself is perceived and evaluated differently. Some critics perceive it as deconstruction of the most sacred cultural foundations. The others see it as rescuing the national identity from cliches and intriguing, remarking the perception of what it means to be Lithuanian. I want to agree with the latest, because the play between heating and cooling national identities in the text of Ivaškevičius allows us to get closer to traces of current reality, which are difficult to read correctly. We must not perceive the crisis and deconstruction of national identity in Ivaškevičius' plays as only a rejection, destruction of past myths, but the ironic recreation, because our modern national consciousness and culture needs them in a time of dynamic globalization. Is it possible to speak about postmodern Lithuanian nation unified by a new deconstructive national identity? Why not?
Thank you very much, Joshua, for an interesting and inspiring paper. I also for dealing with theater and drama, which is not necessarily what you do on an everyday basis. But now the floor is open for our discussion, and I would invite everybody in the audience to put questions to the speakers. We can also exchange thoughts among ourselves. We have some time, and for the questions which are coming from the audience, I would like to ask you always use the microphone, as we have also live transmission to the homepage of the University of Latvia. So please feel free to ask questions. And as I do not see immediate questions from the audience, I'll start the discussion myself. And one of the fascinating things which I find in the conferences is to bring all or to try to link separate papers such as we just heard somehow together. So my question will be to all speakers in this panel. And I will touch upon the main concepts or keywords which you were using. We started with what Yuri Talvet described as a model of interaction between fashion, officialism, and resistance in literature, with a particular emphasis on ethnic culture, as it is said in this paper. And then we moved on to the concepts of cultural diversity, or cultural difference in Vanessa's paper, and you also came to deconstruction. And deconstruction was a keyword in Ausha's paper, which actually rounded it up as in a circle, coming back to questions of national identity, the issues of postmodern nation. So the question, hopefully not too long, the question is, do you see, let's say both of you, Ausha and Vanessa, that the concepts proposed by Professor Talbot are still relevant to what you are doing in your papers? Can you use these for your purposes? And when, in which, let's say, box your descriptions fit then?
Yes, I think yes that this ethic ideas and ethic ground of the past is very important for the modern national identity. And I think, and I wanted to show in my paper that in Ivaškevičius' place, this national myths are very important too. But we have to, I liked this way of thinking of this writer, because he didn't adorize these myths, didn't criticize or reject them, but he made something aesthetic play, something as deconstructive. You play with your myths, your legends, your sacred past, and in my mind it is something deconstructive mind and deconstructive art in this trend, to play, to rewrite, to understand in the new circumstances the myths, the ethics positions of romanticism, of romantics, to take them in our day culture, but in something, in the play way, if I can understand.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I tried to argue that this deconstructive kind of literature written in frames of national literature actually make national literature richer, and it means that this is an act of development of the artistic capacity of national literature. And I think that although I used Homi Bhabha's post-colonial concepts that refer to the situations of political and economical and cultural imperialism, I think that these concepts can be not just appropriate, but so to say, they have to be translated to the special European situation, to the special situation of the European history, political history, and it is inevitably for us to take into account that the historical reality of the struggles for national emancipation in the 19th and in the 20th century was reality. And not just a word or a concept. Although, as I already said, although the nations are considered as imagined communities, all these struggles were reality for people who lived this, who had to survive these processes. And therefore, I think that contemporary deconstruction of not of national values, but not of this deconstruction is not a deconstruction of national values, but it can just re-question them and show the ways in which they can be in which they can build the cultural space as a space of tolerance, as a cultural difference, in a more democratic way, I think. So I think that this national tradition, Jurgi Talvet described, is still a reality which can be accepted in the deconstructive strategies of the contemporary national literatures, in my opinion.
Do you think the examples both of you used, they fit into the same category? Because I know that Ivaškevičius has been really popular in Lithuania. Expulsion has also been successfully transferred, actually by Oskaras Koršunovs to Latvian theatre here. In your case, I understand the public reaction was rather mixed concerning. The question is, do you think these texts belong to the same category? Because I understand that Ivaškevičius is mostly mainstream, still mainstream Lithuanian literature. And what we're talking about, Vanessa, was rather kind of a bit alternative literature dealing with different groups of
as I, in the conclusion, said that the remarks, the critics evaluate Ivaškevičius' plays too very different, and it, yes, mainstream, but they criticized him, a lot of people criticized him and don't want to see his performance of plays. But there are other part of audience who accept his plays. So we can characterize this place as something of scandal in Lithuanian literature tradition, as scandal. But Ivaškevičius' creation is as such. Not only plays, but his novel about partisans. The name in English it translates title Green, was very scandal too, because he don't want to take position of politics. To speaking about Lithuanian or country history. So he wanted to examine today people's or past, very so important past in Lithuanian in his own way. So it is very difficult to do such things, but we ought to do such. Not scandal to scandal, yes, it is something other, not real creation, but to think so about our reality and our literature that your thoughts make a real scandal to the minds of your people. So that.
I'm sorry. The public reactions, they were very different. In cases of Jergović and Nikolaidis, as I already said, many people were very angry in Montenegro and in Croatia. In the case of Andrej Skubic, many people were angry in Slovenia too. And this novel, which I mentioned, which I tried to describe, was not the most scandalous novel from Skubic's opus. The question if, for example, such novels, such deconstructive novels, can still belong to a national literature appeared, and I know this because I was a witness. For example, when the committee of the Slovenian State Awards for Literature had to make a decision whether or not Skubic can win this award, can win this prize. And some people said no, because it is not written in the literary Slovene national language. But in my opinion, of course, it refers so much to the Slovene society, to the Slovene national cultural tradition, to the Slovene cultural memory, that it is inseparable from it. We can't read it without knowing all these concepts, all this tradition which stands behind the novel. So I think that this concept, these contemporary post-colonial concepts can be used for describing the innovation similar to the, maybe similar or close to the innovation which Juri Talvet described in Estonian literary case. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there is a question from audience. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. My question will adapt the conceptual framework of Juri Talvet, but it is addressed to Jurgutiene and to Mataic, to both of them. Okay, I will read it to be more consistent. Can contemporary Lithuanian and Slovenian literatures produce works evading both officiality and fashion? For I see a kind of a highbrow fashion in deconstructing national identities from a liberal perspective. So, can your literatures produce such works, evading both fashion and officiality? Thank you.
Yes. Why not? I think that there are such books and such poetry of romantic tradition, maybe I can say so, to investigating in a more traditional way national life and national future. And perhaps it is the books and poetry of the generation, older generation. And if we think about younger generation, I think that the criticism is, of course, more spread in this generation, and this romantic element is lost. But it is a question about language. How can we speak? With what language we can speak to receive good connections with our audience? And it is perhaps the main idea to keep this values of the past, but to transform or to transfer it in modern language. And this modern language perhaps is more critical, more deconstructive language. But I think that, as I said in my paper, this deconstruction writings didn't weaken a health of a nation. I think that nation becomes stronger when it look in many diversities in his life, and literature can speak about this the diversities. So I answer in very abstract way. Sorry.
Thank you for the question. It is very interesting because I agree that deconstructions of national myths and other myths can be understood as a fashion and fashionalism and so on. But on the other hand, the reality to which all my literary examples written in the same way of deconstructing national myths, written in the same way of fashion, this reality to which they refer was real reality. I can't explain this in a different way. And this was real and terrible for the participants included in this historical reality. And literature which dares to put this historical reality and its values into question, under the question, I think it is so inventive in one cultural space, so inventive that it crosses the borders of a simple fashion.
And can I add something? And I want to say, yes, you asked provocative that the construction may be a stream literature. And I think about myself, that I myself was interested in deconstruction theory, and I teach students on this theory, and I am interested in such literature, you see. But it was, how to say, I would like to see my mind and my national literature something indifferent. I think that in Soviet period we have very, very strong stereotypes of minding, and this deconstruction way is not something the goodness, of course, but in this period it's good for the health of national literature and national identity, to clean some stereotypes and to feel today's reality. And of course to think about ethic problems and ethic ideas, of course, every day in every what you are writing. I agree with this ideas too.
Yes, I would like to add here that, of course, historical situations are repeated practically. Our literatures are so young generally that, of course, this postmodern deconstruction has been something very sudden, something new that has shaken maybe some sacred basis of our culture and so on, and ideology, of course. But if we look at the longer span of literature and to the literature of the Renaissance, for instance, and the Baroque literature, then we see that the same situations, exactly the same situations, were there quite common in European longer traditions. And for instance, the 16th century is the age of the novels of chivalry, the first great fashionable trend in European literature, the first phase of massive literature in Europe. But then there were writers who deconstructed that trend, and François Rabelais in Gargantua Pantagruel has just deconstructed in a way also novels of chivalry, although it of course it parodied just like Cervantes did, especially in his Don Quixote. Created a parody, but it did not. Their work did not result simply in a deconstruction, but they at the same time, relying on lots of elements of deconstruction, they created a new reality. They created their masterpieces. Rabelais, just Gargantua and Pantagruel. Created a vision of totality, life's totality, and ever going on playfulness and change in reality. This was his message, and Michael Bachtin has shown it wonderfully, of course, deeper than any other researcher. And then Cervantes. As for Cervantes, we know very well that he also started this Don Quixote as a parody, simply a parody of the novels of chivalry, and during the 17th and still the 18th century, it was received more or less as simply just humoristic work and parody and work that was meant to make people laugh. But then gradually in the 18th century, at least, moving to the second half of the 18th century, this reception changed. The reception changed as the Romantic times came nearer, and the German writers especially started to understand this as a new philosophy, a symbiotic philosophy emerging from Cervantes' work. So, but of course, I accept that to the creative phase is always more difficult, and it is rare than simply the phase of deconstructing or criticism. It is easy to criticize, but to show something that still should be the goals of existence, it is much more difficult to do it in a novel way. So deconstruction, without any doubt, has a very important role, and the same again I could say well, there are many examples in the literary history. So this is nothing new, I would say, nothing new. But without any doubt, yes, it has as a phenomenon. It does make literature more vivid, and of course the irony. Sometimes it is very good irony, sometimes it is not so good irony, and so also we must look at the deconstruction as a kind of creation and also a kind of construction, because to write a good poem, for instance, even in the deconstructive manner, is not everybody succeeds in it. So it is also creation creation and construction. And the construction is always rare. So we may have a lot of parody, a lot of irony, but good literature is not so often achieved. So this is always, and sometimes entire very long periods pass without any outstanding work. So now we need comparative studies to look sensibly at these deconstruction of in the European perspective. Where are the original and works and which are simply imitation of what has been done, and all these things should be discussed. See, it is quite clear that what may appear as significant in our national space may not have any significance at all in the bigger cultural room. It is maybe treated simply as a kind of imitation of what already has been done in the Western centers. So yes, the question is if our national deconstruction has been able to contribute to some ways to world literature canon, and now this is has to be studied, still researched. This is my position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was a valuable discussion, and I would suggest not to stop it, but to move it into the coffee break. And a couple of brief technical comments. We are slightly behind the schedule, so I suggest we start at 12:10 the next sessions. And there are